During a routine hearing, something entirely unexpected challenged the authority of the most severe person in the room, not through law, but through a silent gesture no one could ignore. From that moment, improbable connections were formed, and seemingly just decisions revealed their hidden cost. But what appeared to be an act of compassion might hold the key to uncovering a system filled with deeply buried secrets, and at its very center, a choice that cannot be undone. Art 1. Christopher. Chris Nolan always felt invisible in the corridors of the Boston Municipal Court. There was something ironic about the man who once designed buildings, now cleaning them in silence. Every day began at 6 in the morning, when the dark corridors filled with the scent of strong detergent and the echo of his steps. As a custodian, his world consisted of silence, grey walls, and memories he would rather forget, but which came to him every night when he lay down to sleep in his small apartment in South Boston, listening to the peaceful breathing of his sleeping daughter. That Wednesday in October, as the autumn leaves danced outside the courthouse windows like golden confetti, the atmosphere was particularly tense. A corruption case in the city office had been going on for 3 days, and Judge Annabelle Annie Keller, known for her iron discipline and inflexibility, was conducting the trial with her characteristic precision. Chris, polishing the floors in the hallway, could hear her clear voice through the slightly open door, firm but not without warmth. Annabelle Keller was 42 years old with 20 years of experience in the judiciary. Her father, Judge Joseph Joe Keller, taught her from childhood that law was not just about statutes, but above all, a duty to serve justice. "Annie," he would say, sitting in his library full of legal volumes, "remember that every verdict you hand down is someone's life. Never take it lightly." These words had guided her throughout her career, but lately she felt the weight of responsibility becoming unbearable. When Judge Annabelle Keller fainted while reading the verdict, no one moved. The lawyers in expensive suits stood like statues, the witnesses whispered nervously among themselves, and the court secretary, with trembling hands, reached for his phone. The courtroom, usually full of controlled solemnity, was suddenly filled with the chaos of whispers and uncertainty. Only he, the man in the blue uniform with the word maintenance, ran without hesitation, abandoning the mop and bucket that stood against the wall. "Ma'am," Chris whispered, kneeling beside the unconscious judge and gently supporting her head. His hands, worn from years of physical labor, first with technical drawings, then with hammers and shovels, were steady and warm. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about social differences or how different their worlds were. He only saw a person who needed help. "Don't worry, you'll be all right." Annie opened her eyes slowly, feeling as if she were in a fog. The first thing she saw was a face she had never noticed before, prematurely tired with streaks of grey in the dark hair, but full of a compassion she hadn't seen in years. In those eyes, there was no judgment, no calculation, no fear, only pure, spontaneous concern. "Thank you," she gasped, trying to regain her dignity and upright position. She felt weak and embarrassed by her sudden indisposition, but something in his gaze made her feel for the first time in months like a person, not a function. "Thank you very much." "It's nothing," Chris replied, helping her to sit on the witness bench. "Is there someone I can call for you? Family?" Annie shook her head. There was no one. Since her divorce 5 years ago, she had lived alone in an elegant apartment in Beacon Hill, and her only companions were legal files and weekly phone calls with her sister in Seattle. "No, thank you. I'm feeling better now." But it wasn't true. She felt lost, as if she had suddenly woken up in a foreign world. The lawyers and trial participants slowly dispersed, casting discreet glances in their direction. Chris waited patiently for everyone to leave, before quietly saying, "Maybe you should stay a little longer. There's no need to rush after an incident like that." That evening, returning to her elegant apartment in Beacon Hill, 3 rooms with a view of the Charles River, full of beautiful furniture she had bought over her years of solitude, Annie couldn't stop thinking about that man. She prepared dinner for herself, as always alone, and sat by the window with a glass of red wine looking at the city lights. Who was he? Why did his help seem so natural when everyone else just stared? There was something in his gesture that reminded her of her father's words about serving people, not regulations. Chris, in turn, returned to his small apartment in South Boston. 2 rooms in a 70s-era building where every wall bore the traces of a life shared with Margaret. Wedding photos still hung in the hallway, and her favorite coffee mug sat on the shelf as if waiting for her return. Here his 12-year-old daughter, Catherine Cathy, was waiting for him, the only light in his life since his wife's death 3 years ago. "Dad, why are you so late?" Cathy asked, looking up from her math textbook. She was doing her homework at the small kitchen table that served as a desk, an eating spot, and the center of family life. Her notebook was neat, filled with even handwriting. She was so much like her mother in that. "A small issue at the courthouse, Kathy." "How was homework?" he replied, kissing her on the forehead and feeling the familiar tightness in his heart. He didn't mention the judge. He didn't mention how for a moment he had felt needed again, important again, like someone more than just a custodian with a past. "Good. Mrs. Thompson said I have a talent for math like Mum." Kathy looked at the photo on the cabinet, Margaret pregnant, laughing into the camera. "Dad, do you think Mum would be proud of me?" Chris swallowed hard. "Mum is proud of you, Kathy, wherever she is." The next day, Annie deliberately went for coffee to a small diner next to the courthouse, Ma's Diner, where employees often met for breaks. The place was the opposite of the elegant cafes on Newbury Street. Old wooden tables, worn chairs, the smell of homemade meatloaf and chicken noodle soup. But it had something authentic about it that reminded her of her childhood at her grandma's, in a small town near Concord. She heard his voice before she saw him, quiet but confident, explaining to a younger colleague how to fix a broken pipe in the basement. "You see, John, in old buildings, everything has its logic. You can't just replace parts. You have to understand the history of the place." "Mr. Nolan is a regular handyman," someone at a neighboring table said. "He used to be an engineer before." The man stopped, seeing the judge. His face tensed, and the typical fear people showed in the presence of authority appeared in his eyes. Annie felt a strange pang in her heart. An engineer. This man, who now washed floors in the courthouse, was an engineer. What happened? What circumstances could have led an educated man to such a change? In her world as a judge, she rarely thought about the human stories hidden behind professional titles. When Chris noticed her, he immediately straightened up and his face adopted a mask of polite reserve. "Good morning, Your Honor." "Good morning. Are you feeling better?" he asked sincerely, and there was a concern in his voice that warmed her heart. "Yes, thanks to you." Annie hesitated, suddenly feeling uncertain. Maybe you could talk with me for a moment about that issue yesterday." It wasn't true. There was no issue, but they both knew it. And in that shared awareness of the lie, there was a kind of intimacy that surprised them both. They sat at a small table in the corner, with a view of Boston Common covered in autumn leaves. Annie ordered coffee, strong, black, as always. Chris ordered hot tea with lemon and honey, like my mum used to make, he said with a smile that made him look 10 years younger and reminded her of the man he must have been once, before everything that had broken him. "You're an engineer?" she asked directly, unable to hide her curiosity any longer. Chris winced slightly as if anticipating a blow. "I was, a long time ago." "What happened?" A long silence. A shadow of pain flickered across his face, and anger appeared in his eyes, but not at her, only at life, at the injustice, at everything that had interrupted his peaceful existence. "I built houses, a small community in Roxbury. I got materials from a supplier the company recommended. I didn't know the materials were faulty, that someone was cutting corners on safety." He stopped, looking out the window at the passers-by. When one of the buildings showed cracks in the foundations, everything fell apart. Not literally. No one died, but people lost their homes, their life savings, and I became the scapegoat. Annie felt a piercing pain in her chest, as if someone had stabbed her with a dagger. She knew that case. She remembered it perfectly. It was she who had signed the verdict that revoked his engineering license. It was her signature, her decision that had destroyed his life. Because of her, this man, who now sat across from her, had lost everything. "Justice is a strange thing, Your Honor," Chris continued, looking at his worn hands. "Sometimes it strikes the wrong people. Sometimes those who are truly guilty escape punishment, and those who are only doing their job honestly pay the price for someone else's wrongdoing." Annie couldn't breathe. She felt guilt filling her lungs like water. How do you bear it?" "I have a daughter. That's enough. She believes her dad is a good man, so I try to be one. What else is there?" Just then, Kathy entered the diner, tall for her 12 years, with 2 braids and her mother's intelligent gaze, wearing a school uniform and carrying a heavy backpack full of books. "Dad, you forgot about the school meeting?" she asked with reproach, but with love in her voice. "Oh, darn, I'm sorry, Your Honor." Chris stood up nervously. "Kathy, this is Miss Keller. Miss Keller, my daughter Catherine." The girl looked at the elegantly dressed woman with a mix of curiosity and caution. Over the years, she had learned to recognize the people who looked down on her father. "Nice to meet you. Dad didn't tell me about you." Annie smiled despite the weight on her heart. "That's because we just met, Kathy." "Oh, is that why Dad is acting so weird? And why does he have a blush on his face?" "Kathy," Chris scolded, blushing even more. Annie laughed, her first genuine laugh in months, maybe years. Your dad is a very good man, Kathy, and very brave. I know. The best in the world. The girl took her father's arm with a tenderness that melted Annie's heart. When Mum died, I thought the world had ended, but Dad showed me that you can be sad and happy at the same time. Let's go, Dad. Mrs. Thompson is probably annoyed by now. When they left, Annie was left alone with her terrible truth and a cup of cold coffee. This man, who had saved her, was a victim of her own verdict. This man, whom she had begun to admire for his dignity and suffering, had lost everything because of her signature. And that girl, so smart, so loving, had a father who had to struggle every day with an injustice that Annie was a co-author of. As God gives, she thought, using her grandmother's favorite phrase. Maybe it wasn't a coincidence. Maybe fate wanted her to be the one to help fix what she had broken. That evening, Annie sat in her office late, reviewing old files by the light of her desk lamp. The courthouse was silent as a tomb, and only the sounds of her steps echoed off the marble floors. The Nolan case was at the bottom of a tall stack of dusty folders, a case that had, with time, become a statistic, a number in an annual report. When she opened it, she saw something that made her heart stop. On the margin of the first page in her own handwriting, too lenient a sentence, "Society demands justice, AK." She didn't remember writing that, but it was her handwriting, her initials, her signature on someone's life sentence. The third page of the file contained a technical expertise she had missed at the time, 19 pages of a detailed report proving that the materials were indeed faulty, that the supplier had falsified certificates, and that Christopher Nolan had not only raised objections even before construction, but had also sent warning letters to the building inspector. Someone had ignored those letters, someone had hidden them, but not him. Annie closed the folder with trembling hands, and tears streamed down her cheeks. For 3 years this man had paid for someone else's wrongdoing, and she was not just a witness to this injustice, she was its executor. Part 2. Love after 40 is different than in youth, deeper, but more delicate, marked by an awareness of the past and a fear of the future. Annie and Chris discovered this over the next few weeks, meeting secretly in small cafes on the outskirts of Boston where no one knew them. There was something beautiful about this conspiracy. 2 adults behaving like teenagers, running away from the world. Their favorite place was a small cafe, the Beacon Hill Bistro, run by an elderly couple who served the best apple pie in town and didn't ask unnecessary questions. Chris told her about his late wife, Margaret, how they met in engineering school, she architecture, he construction, about how they dreamed of a joint company, a house with a garden, and children running in the yard. Maggie always said that people are like buildings, he said, stirring sugar into his coffee and looking at Annie with that special expression that appeared when he spoke of his wife. Some have strong foundations, but a weak facade. Others look beautiful from the outside but are empty inside, and still others. He looked at Annie with a tenderness that made her heart beat faster. They have everything, a solid structure and a beautiful facade. Annie blushed like a teenager, feeling both strange and wonderful. I'm not that beautiful, Chris. You are the most beautiful woman I know, and not just on the outside. His voice was quiet, but confident. You are beautiful in the way you listen, the way you look at people, the way you don't judge, you just try to understand. Back in the apartment in South Boston, Kathy noticed the changes in her father immediately. He hummed an old patriotic song under his breath, Yankee Doodle Dandy, which he always sang when he was happy. He shaved more carefully, chose cleaner shirts, and in the evenings he looked out the window with a strange smile, as if waiting for something wonderful. "Dad, can you tell me the truth about that judge lady?" she asked one evening as they were eating dinner at the kitchen table, mac and cheese that Chris had learned to make from his mother. Chris almost fell out of his chair. "What do you want to know, Kathy? Is she why you're so happy because you're singing again? You haven't sung since Mom got sick." Chris put down his fork and sat next to his daughter. "Yes, Kathy, it's because of her, but it's complicated." "Why? Because she's rich and we're not? Because she lives in a different world?" "No, because she's the one who signed the verdict that made me lose my job." Kathy was silent for a long time, digesting the information with the seriousness of an adult. "So what now?" "I don't know, honey, I really don't, but I like her, and I think she likes me too." "What would Mom say?" Chris smiled sadly, looking at Margaret's photograph on the cabinet. "Mom would say to listen to your heart, but not to forget about your head, and to always remember that the most important thing is your happiness, Kathy. So maybe you should try to listen to both, and remember that I want you to be happy too." Annie, meanwhile, had her own problems. Judge Stanley Wojcik, her superior and political rival since law school, began to ask unpleasant questions. Stanley was the type of man who believed the world belonged to him by birthright. Tall, handsome, from a family of lawyers, self-confident and ruthless in his pursuit of power. "Annie, I hear you've been spending a lot of time in cafes lately," he said during a routine meeting in his office, which he had decorated like a museum of his own glory. Diplomas, awards, photos with influential people. "Everything all right? You don't have personal problems, do you?" "Of course not. Why are you asking?" Annie tried to remain calm, but she felt her heart rate quicken. "Because as your mentor and friend, I'm worried about your reputation. A judge can't afford inappropriate company. People are talking." Annie felt the blood rush to her head. "I don't know what you're talking about, Stanley." Wojciech smiled coldly and placed an envelope with photos on his desk. Annie and Chris at a table in a cafe holding hands. Annie crying and Chris wiping her tears. Their first glances, their first smiles, their first moments of intimacy, all photographed as if in a cheap detective movie. "Do you understand now?" Wojciech's voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "This man is a former criminal, Annie, sentenced by you for causing a building disaster. What will people think when they find out that Judge Keller is secretly meeting with the man she herself stripped of his career? He's not a criminal, but he was convicted of causing a building disaster. Do you know how much those repairs cost the state? How many people suffered because of his negligence? How many families lost their homes because of his irresponsibility?" Annie knew Wojciech was lying, or at least manipulating the facts, but she couldn't prove it. Not yet. She needed more time, more evidence. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. "Only what's best for you, Annie. End this, for your own safety and for the good of this institution we've built over the years." That evening, Annie met with Chris at their favorite restaurant in Beacon Hill, the Red Lion, where they served the best roast duck with apples in town and where the waiters knew them well enough to give them a table in a quiet corner. Annie was pale and silent, barely touching her food. "What's wrong?" Chris asked immediately, noticing her state. Annie told him about the photos and Wojciech's threats. Chris listened in silence, his face hardening with every word. When she finished, he sighed heavily. "He was right about one thing," he finally said. "I am the convicted one. I'm the one who's ruining your reputation." "Don't say that. You haven't ruined anything." Annie, it was the first time he used her first name, and the way he said it, with tenderness and sadness at the same time, gave her a chill. "We can't risk your career. Not for something that has no future anyway." "Why doesn't it have a future?" Chris looked at his worn hands, comparing them in his mind to her delicate fingers. "Because we come from different worlds. You have power, prestige, money. You live in a beautiful apartment. You drive a car that costs more than I make in a year. I only have a daughter and broken dreams. What about love? Doesn't that count?" The word hung in the air like a spark over gunpowder. Neither of them had said it before, but they both knew that's what they were talking about. "Annie," Chris reached across the table and took her hands in his. "I love you too. That's why I have to leave." "No, I won't let him destroy us." "This isn't a fight you can win. Wojciech has power, connections, money. He has the system on his side. What if I find a way? What if I prove it wasn't your fault?" Chris shook his head. "That was 3 years ago. The documents were destroyed. The witnesses disappeared. Who would believe you now? I'll find a way, I promise you." At that moment, Kathy entered the restaurant with 2 school friends. She saw her father with the elegant woman and immediately understood that this was the mysterious lady who had made her dad smile again. "Dad," she walked over to the table shyly. "Kathy, what are you doing here?" "Agatha had a birthday. We were going for ice cream at the mall. But I saw you through the window." She looked at Annie with curiosity. "Is this the judge lady?" Annie smiled, even though tears were still on her cheeks. "Yes, I'm Annabelle. It's so nice to meet you, Kathy." "Catherine, but everyone calls me Kathy." The girl sat next to her father with a naturalness that surprised Annie. "Why are you crying, Miss Annabelle?" "Kathy," Chris scolded her. "It's okay," Annie said, wiping her eyes. "Sometimes adults cry too when they're sad." "But why are you sad? You're sitting with the best person in the world." Annie looked at Chris and then at his daughter, so similar to him in that spontaneous goodness, but with someone else's gaze, her mother's probably. "Because some people think your dad and I shouldn't be friends." "Why? Because you're rich?" "But Dad says money isn't everything." "That's true, Kathy. But people like to gossip." Catherine frowned, thinking intensely. "But if you like each other and no one is getting hurt, what does it matter to anyone else?" From the mouth of a child, Annie thought. "You're absolutely right, Kathy. Of course I am. Dad always says the most important thing is to be a good person, and you're a good person. I can see it in your eyes." "I try to be." "That's enough." Catherine stood up and kissed her father on the cheek. "I have to get back to my friends. Bye, Dad." "Bye, Annabelle." "Anne, stop being sad. You have too many reasons to be happy." When the girl left, Chris watched her with a mixture of pride and worry. "She's wonderful," Annie said, "and too smart for her age. Like her mother." Maggie also had that ability to see straight to the heart of things. "Chris," Annie leaned across the table, "let's not give up so easily. For her, too. Kathy deserves to see her father happy." "What do you mean?" "Give me 1 week. 1 week to find the truth about that building case. If I can't, and if you can," Annie smiled through her tears, "it means that a blessing in disguise really exists." But neither of them knew that Wojciech was already planning the final blow, and that in this game, there were still players they hadn't even suspected. Lawyer Peter Monroe sat in his luxurious office on Newbury Street and studied the Nolan case files by the light of a lamp with a genuine Tiffany lampshade. Wojciech had paid him a lot of money to find compromising information about Judge Keller's affair, but Peter had discovered something more, a truth that could destroy not only Annie, but Wojciech himself and several other prominent figures in the Boston establishment. The problem was that Peter also had his own secrets, and Wojciech knew about them. The phone on the desk rang at 11 in the evening. "Monroe, do you have the documents?" Wojciech's voice was as cold as steel. "Yes. But Stanley, there's a problem." "What problem?" "Nolan was innocent. The documents clearly show it. The materials were indeed faulty, and the expert who certified them was bribed. What's more, someone deliberately hid the reports that would have cleared him." Silence on the other end of the line. Then a calm, menacing voice. "That's not your concern, Peter. Your concern is destroying Judge Keller. The rest doesn't matter to me. But if it comes to light, nothing will come to light. Unless you want your little irregularities from last year to come to light, those picturesque scams with inheritance files." Peter clenched his jaw. Wojciech knew everything about the falsified wills, the misappropriated inheritances, the elderly people he had cheated. "I understand. Good. I want those photos in the newspaper by the end of the week. And I want a comment with them about how Judge Keller is abusing her position for personal gain. What if she defends herself? That's your job, to make sure she has nothing to defend herself with." After hanging up, Peter sat heavily in his chair. In front of him were 2 piles of documents, one proving Chris Nolan's innocence, the other documenting his own crimes, which Wojciech could expose at any moment. The choice was simple, but was it the right one? In the apartment in South Boston, Kathy was doing her English homework. The topic was, "Write an essay about justice." She sat over the paper for a long time, chewing on the end of her pen and thinking about her father and Miss Annabelle. Was justice just about court verdicts, or was it something more? Finally, she began to write, "Justice is not just punishment for the bad, it's also a reward for the good, and sometimes it means admitting a mistake and fixing it, even if it's difficult and painful." She didn't know that her simple wisdom would soon become the most important thing in the lives of everyone she loved. Part 3. Annie spent the entire weekend reviewing old files in the courthouse archive, which was located in the basement of the 18th century building, a labyrinth of corridors and rooms filled with dusty folders containing hundreds of thousands of human stories. The secretary, Agnes Miller, helped her in silence, bringing coffee in plastic cups and sandwiches from a vending machine, pretending not to notice how much the judge's hands were trembling with each new document. Agnes Miller had worked at the courthouse for 20 years, since she was a young girl dreaming of a legal career, which was interrupted by marriage to a car mechanic and the birth of 3 children. Now at 42, she was the only person in the building who knew all the secrets, all the connections, all the ugly truths hidden beneath the veneer of official seriousness. "Your Honor," Agnes finally spoke as the clock on the wall struck 9 in the evening. "Can I say something?" Annie looked up from the file cabinet, squinting after a full day of reading in the dim light. "Of course, Agnes. I've worked here for 20 years. I've seen different judges, different cases. I've seen people sell their consciences for promotions, how they twist the truth for their own gain." Agnes sat across from her on a plastic chair. "But I've never seen anyone care so much about the truth as you. What are you trying to say? That maybe you're not the only one looking for the truth about the Nolan case. Maybe the truth is also looking for you." Annie looked at her, surprised. "That sounds very philosophical for a Friday night in an archive. My husband John always says there are no coincidences in life, only opportunities that people either take or squander. And your meeting with Mr. Nolan, that was not a coincidence. And you think it's my opportunity? I think Mr. Nolan is the best person I've met in this building. Do you see how he treats the cleaning staff, how he talks to the security guards, how he helps the younger employees?" Agnes smiled. "And I think you know that too." Annie felt a warmth in her heart. "Thank you, Agnes." "You're welcome, and now please look at this." Agnes pulled a thin folder from the very bottom of a box, as if it had been waiting there on purpose. These are the protocols from the tender commission meetings from that time. They accidentally fell among other files, but maybe it wasn't an accident. Annie opened the folder and gasped. There were the signatures of the commission members who chose the faulty building materials. And in the first place, the signature of Judge Stanley Wojcik as legal advisor to the investment. "Oh my God," Annie whispered. He knew about the flaws and chose those materials knowingly for his own gain. "There's something else," Agnes said quietly. On the last page, Annie turned the pages with trembling hands and saw a bank transfer slip. Wojcik had received an advisory fee of $200,000 from the company supplying the faulty materials, an amount that at the time was a fortune. "Agnes, do you realize what this means?" "Yes. It means that Mr. Nolan paid for someone else's wrongdoing for 3 years, and that his daughter thought her dad was a criminal, while the real criminals walked free and got rich at the expense of innocent people." Annie felt everything inside her turn upside down. "I have to show this to Chris." "Not here," Agnes warned, looking around nervously. "Judge Wojcik has his people everywhere. It's better to meet somewhere outside the city where no one will see us." On Sunday, Annie arranged to meet Chris in Aspen under the pretext of a trip to the Rockies. Kathy went with them. Annie insisted that the girl be there for what she had to say. It was her family, her future, her right to know the truth. They took a train from Boston to Aspen on a foggy autumn morning filled with the smell of burning leaves. Kathy sat by the window, delighted with the views of the mountains that appeared like ghosts in the mist, while Annie and Chris exchanged nervous glances over her head. They sat on a bench by Maroon Lake, surrounded by autumn peaks covered in the first snow. The water was black as a mirror, reflecting the stately pines and rocks. Kathy was collecting colorful leaves, red, gold, brown, while Annie told Chris about her discovery. "It can't be," Chris repeated, reading the documents a third, fourth, fifth time. That means you were framed, and that Wojcik knew about it from the beginning. What's more, he was the main beneficiary of that corruption." Chris sat in silence, looking at the lake and the mountains that had witnessed so many human dramas. 3 years, he finally said, in a voice full of pain. "For 3 years I believed I deserved what happened to me. For 3 years I blamed myself for Kathy having to be ashamed of her father. And now I don't know what to feel. Anger, relief, regret for lost time, rage at the people who destroyed my life for a few $100,000. Kathy walked over to them with a bouquet of autumn leaves arranged in a beautiful composition of colors. "Dad, why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" Chris hugged his daughter, feeling the scent of her hair, children's shampoo and autumn air. "Kathy, remember how I told you that sometimes life is unfair?" "I remember, and you said you have to accept it. It turns out that sometimes you can get justice back." The girl looked at Annie with a flash of understanding in her eyes. "You found the truth? I found it. So what happens now? Can Dad go back to his real job?" Annie and Chris exchanged glances. "We don't know yet, Kathy," her father replied, "but we're going to fight. All of us together." Annie smiled, feeling that this little girl had just offered her something she had been looking for her whole life, a real family. All of us together. They didn't know that from a distance. Peter Monroe, who had come to Aspen on Wojcik's orders, was watching them. He sat in a car with tinted windows, taking photos with a telephoto lens and recording the conversation with a special directional microphone. Every word, every gesture, every smile, everything was documented and prepared for use. That evening at the Sabawa Hotel, Annie was alone with Chris for a longer time for the first time. Kathy was sleeping in the next room, tired from the mountain air and the day's emotions, and they sat on the terrace looking at the stars over the Rockies, which shone brighter than in the city. "Chris," Annie began, cuddling up to him in the cool air, "can you forgive me for that verdict, for those 3 years, for not being careful enough?" "Annie," Chris took her hands in his, feeling their delicacy and trembling. "You were a victim too. Wojcik manipulated you just like me. He used you as a tool. You didn't know about the corruption. But I should have been more careful, checked more thoroughly. It's my job to check, to investigate, not to sign verdicts blindly. Stop blaming yourself. It's over." Chris moved closer, feeling her warmth. "What matters is what happens now." Annie looked into his eyes, in which the stars were reflected. "And what happens now? Now we're going to fight these people, and we're going to be together, no matter what the future brings." Their first kiss was as delicate as a butterfly's touch, but full of 3 years of suppressed passion and pain. When they parted, Annie was crying. "Why are you crying?" "Because for the first time in a very long time, I feel happy, and that terrifies me, because I know how easily happiness can be lost." I sometimes cry from happiness too, Chris admitted. But maybe it's worth being scared sometimes, if it means we're truly living, not just existing. On Monday, Annie returned to work more determined than ever. She hadn't slept all night, planning her strategy for confronting Wojciech. She went straight to his office, carrying the envelope with the evidence like a sword of justice. "Stanley, we need to talk." Wojciech looked up from his papers, and the familiar smile appeared on his face. Polite, but with a hint of superiority. "Annie, how was the weekend? I heard you were traveling with that friend?" "I was, and I found some very interesting things." Annie placed the documents on his desk, with the satisfaction of a hunter who has finally caught his prey. Wojciech didn't move, didn't even look at the papers. His calmness was unsettling. "What is it?" "Your signature on the contract to supply faulty building materials, and a transfer for $200,000 from the company that supplied those materials." A shadow crossed Wojciech's face, but he quickly regained his composure. "That must be some misunderstanding, Annie." "There's no misunderstanding. You profited from faulty materials, and then you let an innocent man bear the consequences. For 3 years. Wojciech stood up calmly and closed the office door. When he turned around, his mask of politeness was gone. Annie, we've worked together for so long, and you still don't understand how the world works." "I understand perfectly. That's why I'm going to the prosecutor's office with this." "I don't think so." His voice was now as cold as ice. "Why not?" Wojciech opened his cabinet and pulled out a thick envelope. "Because I have photos here of your romantic weekend with a criminal, and a recording of your conversation in which you admit to conspiring against the justice system." Annie felt the ground give way beneath her feet. That's an insinuation. "Those are facts, Annie. And if you don't destroy these documents immediately, tomorrow morning the whole city will know that Judge Annabelle Keller conspired with a convicted criminal to rehabilitate him in exchange for sex." "No one will believe that." "Annie," Wojciech smiled coldly, like a shark before an attack. "People will believe any rumor if it's juicy enough, and this one is very, very juicy. A young, attractive judge, mysterious meetings, an affair with a criminal. The media will fight over this." Annie stood in silence, feeling everything crumbling around her. "What do you want?" "I want you to forget about this, Nolan. I want you to stop meeting with this man, and I want you to vote the way I tell you to for the next 5 years. And if I don't agree, I will destroy you, Annie. I'll destroy your career, your reputation, everything you care about, and by the way, I'll take care of your lover too." "Do you think it will be hard to find new charges against him? Some unpaid tickets, some inaccuracies in his tax returns?" Annie left Wojciech's office in a daze. Had she really spent the last 10 years with this man? Had she really respected him and considered him a mentor? How could she have been so blind to his true nature? In her office, she slammed the door and burst into tears for the first time in years. For the first time in her life, she didn't know what to do, how to fight an enemy who held all the cards. Agnes knocked quietly and came in with a cup of herbal tea. "Your Honor, how was the talk?" "Bad, Agnes. Very bad. Worse than I thought." "Can I help?" Annie looked at her secretary, a woman who for 20 years had been a witness to all the intrigues in the courthouse, but had always remained loyal and honest, like a rock in an ocean of corruption. "Do you ever regret choosing the path of honesty instead of the easy one?" Agnes smiled sadly. "Every day, Your Honor, and every day I'm proud of it, even if it means losing everything you care about, especially then. Because what's left for a person when they lose their conscience?" Annie wiped her tears. "Agnes, could you make copies of these documents for me, and hide them in a safe place where Wojciech won't find them?" "I already did, Your Honor. They're at my husband's auto shop, hidden among the spare parts. No one looks there." Annie smiled for the first time that day. "You really are an angel, Agnes." "No, Your Honor. I just believe that the truth always wins. Sometimes it just has to wait a little for the right moment." But the truth was up against more than just Wojciech. That evening, in a luxurious apartment in Back Bay with a view of the entire city, people met who had much more to lose than the career of one judge or the honor of one engineer. Part 4. Chris returned from Aspen a different man. For the first time in 3 years, he walked tall, looked people in the eye, and smiled at the neighbors in the stairwell. There was a confidence in his movements that had been buried for years under layers of humiliation and shame. Kathy noticed the change immediately. "Dad, are you happy?" she asked at breakfast, eating oatmeal with honey that Chris made for her every morning. "Yes, Kathy. For the first time in a very long time, yes." "Is it because of Ms. Annabelle?" "Because of her, too, but mostly because of you, and because I finally know I'm not a bad person, that I didn't fail you or Mom." Kathy put down her spoon and looked at her father very seriously. "Dad, can you tell me about Mom? About how you met, what she was like when she was young?" Chris sat next to his daughter, feeling the familiar tightness in his heart, that always accompanied memories of Margaret. We met at engineering school. I was studying construction. She was studying architecture. She was the most beautiful girl in our year, but that wasn't the point. What was? The point was that she looked at the world as if it were full of wonders. Even an ordinary building, she could look at it and see something beautiful, something others missed. She said that every building has a soul, like Ms. Annabelle looks at people. Chris smiled, surprised by his daughter's accurate observation. Yes, like Ms. Annabelle. Do you think Mom would have liked her? I think Mom would be happy to see that someone cares about us and that someone made her husband smile again. At work that day, Chris couldn't focus. He cleaned the corridors mechanically, but his thoughts revolved around Annie's discovery and what would happen next. Could his name really be cleared after 3 years? After 3 years, would anyone even care? Around noon, a young security guard, Peter Miller, came to him. "Mr. Nolan, someone's looking for you at the exit. Some elegant man in an expensive suit." Chris went to the main entrance and saw a man who looked familiar from the newspapers. Peter Monroe, one of the most expensive lawyers in Boston, known for representing the rich and influential no matter how dirty their cases were. "Mr. Christopher Nolan?" "Yes, that's me. Peter Monroe, lawyer. Could I have a word with you? It's in your best interest." Chris knew the name. Monroe was the lawyer who defended politicians in corruption cases, entrepreneurs in fraud cases, and the rich in domestic violence cases. A man without scruples, but with influence. "What do you want to talk about?" "About your future, and about your daughter's future." They went to a small cafe, the Continental, near the courthouse. Monroe ordered an espresso and a croissant. Chris only had tea. He suddenly felt his stomach lurch into his throat. "Mr. Nolan, I'll be direct because we're both adults." Monroe put sugar in his coffee with surgical precision. "I know about your affair with Judge Keller. I also know about the documents she found, and about your plans to use them." Chris felt his heart beat faster. "So what? What's in it for you is a choice. Either you end this affair and leave Boston for good, or life will become very unpleasant for you and your daughter." "I don't understand." Monroe pulled out his phone and showed him a photo. Kathy leaving school alone, carrying a heavy backpack, smiling and carefree. Another photo, Kathy in a store, buying bread and milk. A third, the girl waiting for the bus. A pretty girl, smart. You can see it in her eyes. It would be a shame if something happened to her. Chris jumped up from his chair so violently that he knocked over his coffee. "If you touch my daughter, no one wants to touch her, sir." Monroe spoke calmly, as if discussing the weather. "We just want you to understand that this game is too big for you. Too many influential people have too much to lose." "What people?" "People who can make you disappear without a trace, or make your daughter have an accident on her way home from school. The statistics are troubling. So many children die in accidents every year." Chris sat back down, feeling nauseous and cold sweat on his back. "What do you want?" "I want you to write a letter to Judge Keller, that you're breaking up, that it was a mistake, that you don't want to see her anymore, and then I want you and your daughter to leave Boston, for good. New York, Seattle, preferably abroad. And if I don't agree?" Monroe smiled coldly like a crocodile before an attack. "Mr. Nolan, have you ever heard about accidents at schools? Children sometimes get hit by cars, or fall downstairs, or just disappear on their way home. Statistically, it happens more often than people think." Chris looked at this man, and for the first time in his life, he felt real hatred, a pure, primitive hatred that burned his insides. "You're a monster. I'm a realist. Your daughter can live a long and happy life, somewhere far from here, with a father who chose her safety over a romantic adventure with a woman who is out of his league anyway. What if I went to the police? With what? With a story about how a lawyer politely offered you a job in another city?" Monroe stood up and left the money on the table. "You have until tomorrow evening, the letter to Judge Keller, and tickets out of Boston. Or—" He didn't finish. He left, leaving Chris alone with his terror and desperation. That evening, Chris couldn't eat dinner. He sat at the table, looking at Kathy doing her math homework, his favorite subject which he once wanted to teach her more than school could, and wondered how one could choose between love and a child's life. "Dad, are you okay?" Kathy asked, looking at him with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Yes, honey, I'm just thinking about Miss Annabelle. Among other things." Kathy put down her pen and walked over to her father. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "If Mom were alive, would she want you to be happy?" Chris felt his throat tighten. "Yes, Kathy. Mom always wanted me to be happy. It was the most important thing to her." "Then why do you look like you want to cry?" Chris hugged his daughter, feeling her warmth and trust. Because sometimes happiness is a very complicated thing, Kathy. Because sometimes to protect what's most important, you have to give up what you really want. But it's still happiness, right? If you're doing something good, yes, it can still be happiness. That night, Chris didn't sleep. He walked around the apartment, looking at the photos of Margaret on the walls, at Kathy's drawings attached to the refrigerator with magnets, at everything that made up his small, modest life. Could he leave all this for a woman he had only known for a few weeks? On the other hand, could he condemn Annie to a life with a man who ran away from problems? And most of all, could he risk Kathy's life for his own happiness? In the morning, he made a decision. He wrote a letter to Annie, short, painful, and full of lies. Every word was like a stone thrown at his own heart. Annie came to work earlier than usual, wanting to review the documents one more time, to find a way to defeat Wojciech without endangering Chris and his daughter. On her desk lay an envelope with no sender. Inside was a short letter written in Chris's hand. "Annabelle, this was a mistake. I'm sorry I let you believe there could be something more between us. We come from different worlds, and that will never change. I'm not the man for you. Please don't look for me. Sincerely, Chris." Annie read the letter 3 times, unable to believe her eyes. It was impossible. After what they had been through in Aspen, after that kiss, after all the conversations, after the way they looked at each other, she ran to the window. Chris's car wasn't in the parking lot. He drove an old VW Beetle that everyone at the courthouse knew. She asked the security guard. Nolan hadn't come to work today. He hadn't come yesterday. He hadn't come the day before yesterday. She called his phone. It was off. She got in her car and drove to South Boston through the whole city, which suddenly seemed foreign and hostile to her. She knocked on the door of Chris's apartment on the 3rd floor of the 70s-era building. No one answered. The neighbor across the hall, an elderly woman in a robe and curlers, peeked her head out. "Are you looking for Mr. Nolan?" "Yes." "Do you know where he is?" "He left the day before yesterday morning with the little girl." "They had a lot of luggage. He said for a long time, maybe forever." Annie leaned against the wall, feeling her world collapse. "He didn't say where." "No, but he looked very sad. And the girl was crying. She said she didn't want to leave, that she liked it here, that she had friends here. But he just kept repeating that they had to, that he had no choice." On the way back to the city, Annie pulled over and cried for the first time in years. Was she really so wrong about Chris? Was he really a coward who ran away when things got difficult? Was he really just another man who promised a lot and then disappeared? Or... Annie took out her phone and called Agnes. "Agnes, can you check if anyone was in my office today before I arrived?" "I'll check the surveillance, Your Honor. I'll call you back in a minute." 10 minutes later, Agnes called back. "Your Honor, Lawyer Monroe was in the building the day before yesterday at 7 in the morning. The security guard let him in because he said he had something important for you." Annie felt everything fall into place. Monroe. Monroe delivered the letter. And that means Chris didn't leave voluntarily. But why? What could have forced this man to flee? The answer came to her. Kathy. They threatened his daughter. Annie turned around and drove back to South Boston. This time she knocked on the neighbor's door. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry to bother you. My name is Annabelle Keller. Did Mr. Nolan look scared the day before yesterday morning?" The old woman looked at her suspiciously. "Who are you?" "Police. I'm a friend, and I'm very worried about him." "Well, in that case..." The woman let her into the small apartment that smelled of flowers and tea. "Coffee, thank you. Please tell me about that morning." "Mr. Nolan was packing from dawn. I heard it through the wall. And the little girl was crying. She said she didn't want to leave, that she liked her school here, her friends, but he just kept repeating that they had to, that it was for her safety." "For her safety?" "Yes. And he also said something about how sometimes you have to choose between love and a child's life. Strange, isn't it? What could that mean?" Annie felt the blood drain from her face. They threatened Kathy. They threatened a child to force Chris to leave. This was the tactic of the worst criminals, to attack what is most precious. "Ma'am, did you hear where they were going?" "Not exactly, but I saw them through the window, getting on a bus. The one to New York, I think, at 8 in the morning. New York." Annie looked at her watch. If they left the day before yesterday, they were already there. But New York is a big city. How could she find them in a metropolis of millions? She returned home and started making calls. To all the hotels, guest houses, and friends in the capital, no one had seen Chris and Kathy. Only in the evening did she get a text message from an unknown number. "We're safe. Don't look for us. See." Annie replied immediately. "I know you were forced. I'm fighting on. Wait for me." The answer came an hour later. "Too late. Forgive me. Someone has to protect Kathy." Annie sat in her living room until morning, holding her phone and crying. For the first time in her life, she was truly in love, and that love had been taken from her by people who would stop at nothing, not even threatening a child. But Annabelle Keller was not a woman who gave up easily. The next day, she did something Wojciech and his people never expected. She went to the office of the biggest newspaper in Boston. Part 5. The editor-in-chief of the Boston Globe, John Thompson, was an old hand who in 30 years of his career had seen everything, from the fall of the Cold War to the contemporary corruption. His office on the third floor of a historic townhouse on Newbury Street was full of trophies, diplomas, and photographs with important personalities. But when Judge Annabelle Keller entered his office with documents proving corruption in the judiciary, even he was surprised. "Your Honor, do you realize the consequences of what you're showing me?" Thompson looked through the documents a second time, adjusting his glasses. "These are very serious accusations." "I realize," Annie replied calmly, although her hands were trembling. "And that's why I'm here." Thompson looked through the documents again, making notes in his journalist's notebook. "Judge Wojciech is one of the most important figures in the Boston judiciary. He has influence, connections, and most importantly, excellent lawyers. That's exactly why people have a right to know the truth. But why are you doing this? What do you care about this Nolan? Is he the one who's making you risk your career for justice?" Annie was silent for a long time, looking out the window at Boston Common. "Sometimes a person has to choose between their career and their conscience. And I'm choosing my conscience. What if Wojciech sues us for defamation? What if he finds a way to pressure us into retracting the article? He won't sue because the truth is the best defense. And I'll give you all the documents, all the evidence." Thompson smiled for the first time during the conversation. "I like you, Judge. I've always respected people who aren't afraid to fight the system, especially when the system is rotten. Does that mean you'll help?" "It means that tomorrow morning the front page will belong to your story." The article came out on Wednesday morning under the headline, "Corruption in the Court. Judge convicted innocent man for a bribe." Annie waited for the reaction, sitting in her office and drinking her 6th coffee of the morning. Her hands were shaking so hard that the cup rattled against the saucer. She didn't have to wait long. At 9 in the morning, Wojciech burst into her office like a storm, slamming the door so loudly that the whole corridor could hear. "Are you insane? Do you know what you've done?" "I told the truth. You've destroyed me. You've destroyed yourself. You've destroyed everyone." His face was red with rage and the veins on his neck bulged ominously. Annie looked at him calmly, feeling a strange satisfaction. "Stanley, for 20 years, I respected you. I thought you were a man of honor. But honor is not the same as the ability to hide the truth. Annie, you don't understand how all this works. You can't just... You can. And that's exactly what I did." Wojciech sat heavily in the chair, suddenly looking his 60 years. "They're going to destroy you, you know that? Monroe already has the documents about you prepared. Photos, recordings, witnesses. Let them try. The truth always wins." "The truth?" Wojciech laughed bitterly. "Annie, the truth is a luxury not everyone can afford. In the real world, what matters is power, money, influence." At 11 o'clock, the prosecutor's office initiated an investigation against Wojciech. At 12, his assistants began to remove documents from his office under the supervision of a prosecutor. At 1 in the afternoon, he was already arrested as he tried to leave the city. Annie sat in her office and waited. She knew this was just the beginning of the war. Wojciech had friends, allies, people who wouldn't let him fall alone. The phone rang at 3 o'clock. An unknown number. "Annabelle Keller?" "Yes, speaking." "My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm Christopher Nolan's ex-wife. I was his wife, but..." Annie felt her heart stop beating. "I'm sorry, but Chris said his wife was dead. Because I died. To him and to our daughter, 3 years ago, when I couldn't stand the fact that people looked at us like a criminal's family." Annie couldn't catch her breath. But I ran away, Your Honor. I left Chris and Kathy because I couldn't defend them, because I was weak and selfish. I read the newspaper today, and I know I have to come back." "Where are you?" "In New York. And I know where Chris and Kathy are." Annie grabbed her keys and handbag. "I'm going to New York. Please give me the address." The trip to New York City took forever. Annie drove on the I-90 listening to the radio, where every hour there were updates about the corruption scandal in the Boston courthouse. Her name appeared as a judge whistleblower, but she only thought about getting to Chris as soon as possible and convincing him that they could fight together. In New York, in front of an old apartment building in Brooklyn, a woman who looked like an older version of Kathy was waiting for her. The same eyes, the same face shape, the same delicate features. But there was something broken in her face, as if for those 3 years she had paid for her escape. "Margaret Hayes," she introduced herself. "But to my daughter, I'm still Mom. I'll always be. Annabelle Keller. Thank you for agreeing to help me." They drove in silence through the city, and finally Margaret spoke up. "Do you really love him?" "Yes. enough to stay with him when it gets tough. Because it will be tough, Ms. Annabelle. Chris is a man who doesn't forgive easily. Not himself, not others. For 3 years he lived with the belief that he had failed us all. I know, and I'm ready for the fight. Because there will also be a fight. With the past, with doubts, with people who won't forget. They stopped in front of an old townhouse in Brooklyn. They're on the 3rd floor, Margaret said. They rented a small room from my aunt. Shall we go? Chris opened the door and saw 2 women, the one he loved now and the one he had loved once. For a moment he stood there as if turned to stone, unable to believe his eyes. Dad? Kathy ran up and saw her mother. Mom, but you're dead. Dad said, I'm alive, honey. I was just a very sick mum who ran away instead of fighting. Margaret knelt in front of her daughter. But I'm not running anymore. Annie looked at the family scene and felt she should leave. This wasn't her moment. This wasn't her family. Annabelle, Chris said quietly, why did you come? Because I love you. And because I know you didn't leave voluntarily. But I did leave. To protect Kathy, that's not the same as cowardice. Margaret put her hands on her daughter's shoulders. Kathy, come on. Will you show me what you look like now? How you've grown up. We'll leave Dad with Miss Annabelle. When they were alone, Chris leaned against the wall. Annabelle, you don't understand. They threatened my daughter. I can handle anything, but not the idea that someone will get hurt because of me. They're not threatening them anymore. What? Annie told him about the article, about Wojciech's arrest, about the investigation. Chris listened in silence, his face expressing disbelief, hope, and finally, relief. It means you're free. Your name will be cleared and the people who threatened you will go to prison. Chris sat down in an old armchair. I can't believe it. After 3 years. Believe it. Now tell me, are you coming back to Boston with me? What about Margaret? You have to figure that out between yourselves, but I'm waiting for your answer. Chris looked at Annie. Do you realize you've destroyed your career for a man you've known for a few months? I didn't destroy it, I saved it. For the first time in my life, I'm doing something I'm truly proud of. What if people say you did it for an affair? Then let them say it. There's only one truth. I did it because it was the right thing to do. At that moment, Margaret and Kathy returned. The girl hugged her father. Dad, Mom told me everything. About why she left. About how much she regrets it. And she said she can stay with us in Boston if we want. But not as Mom and Dad, just as family in a new way. Chris looked at his ex-wife. Maggie? Chris, I'm not coming back to you as a wife. I'm coming back as Kathy's mother and a friend who wants to fix her mistakes. Nothing more. My love for you is in the past. And what about Annabelle? Margaret smiled for the first time. Annabelle seems to me like a woman who knows how to fight for what she loves, and that's exactly the kind of woman you need. Kathy looked at everyone in turn. Does that mean we're going to be a family? All together? No, Kathy, Chris said gently. It means we're going to be people who love and care for each other. That might be even better than a regular family. Annie took Chris's hand. Does that mean you're coming back? It means we're coming back. If you still want me, I do. Forever. Part 6. 6 months later, the Boston courts were undergoing the biggest reform in their history. The corruption scandal, initiated by a brave article in the Boston Globe, brought down not only Wojciech, but an entire network of connections. Lawyer Monroe was sentenced to 7 years in prison, and a dozen other lawyers and officials lost their licenses. Christopher Nolan officially regained his engineering license in a solemn ceremony at the American Society of Civil Engineers. Annie was with him during the rehabilitation ceremony, holding his hand and feeling a pride she had never experienced before in her career. How do you feel? She asked as they left the building onto Copley Square. Like I've woken up from a bad dream, he replied, looking at Faneuil Hall in the afternoon sun, but also like I'm starting a new life. We are, she corrected him. We're starting a new life. Judge Stanley Wojciech was sentenced to 6 years in prison and a fine of $1 million. Lawyer Monroe lost his license and also went to jail for 5 years. Annie, despite attempts to slander her by some media as a judge leading a double life, was not only cleared of all charges, but was promoted to the position of head of the criminal division. Justice does win sometimes, she said to Agnes on her first day in the new role, arranging files on a bigger desk in a bigger office. It always wins, Your Honor. Sometimes it just has to wait for the right people. Chris started a small construction company, Nolan and Daughter, a playful nod to Kathy, who was already helping him on weekends, learning her father's trade. His first contract was the renovation of a historic building in Beacon Hill, ironically, the same one Annie lived in. Don't you think that's a sign? She asked, looking out the window at the scaffolding where her husband was working. I think it's luck, he replied, putting down his hard hat and wiping sweat from his forehead. A blessing in disguise, as my grandma used to say. Kathy adapted to the new family situation better than anyone expected. Margaret found a job at a New York architectural studio, but she came to Boston every other weekend, staying in a small apartment she rented not far from her old family. "It's weird," Kathy said to Annie during one of those weekends, as they all ate dinner together in Annie and Chris's new home. "I have 2 moms and 1 dad. That's probably not normal, right?" "What does normal mean?" Annie asked, serving everyone roast duck with apples. "I don't know. Like other kids in class." "Kathy, are you happy?" "Very." "Do you feel loved?" "Yes, by everyone." "Then our life is exactly as it should be." The girl smiled, showing off her new braces. "In that case, I really like our abnormal life." Annie and Chris had a civil wedding in a small circle, a year after their first meeting at the courthouse. Kathy was a witness. Margaret performed the ceremony as a friend of the groom, and Agnes cried in the first row. The ceremony took place in a historic hall at City Hall, the same one where the Founding Fathers had their ceremonies. "Do you promise to love him in sickness and in health, for richer and for poorer?" the civil official asked. An older man with a gentle face who in his 40 years of work had seen thousands of couples, but rarely one that radiated happiness despite their hardships. "I do," Annie replied, looking into Chris's eyes, which reflected the sun's rays streaming through the stained glass windows. "And I promise to fight for us, no matter what the future brings." "And do you promise to love her for richer and for poorer, in sickness and in health?" "I do," Chris said, his voice trembling with emotion. "And I promise never to run away again when things get tough. I promise to be the man she deserves." When the official announced them husband and wife, the room filled with applause. Kathy was the first to run up to them with a bouquet of white roses. "Now you're really a family," she said, hugging them both, "and I have the 2 best parents in the world." After the ceremony, they all went to a restaurant in Copley Square, the same place where governors and presidents once feasted. Annie invited not only her closest family, but also everyone who had helped them in their fight for the truth. Agnes with her husband John, Editor Thompson from the Boston Globe, and even a few judges who had dared to support her in the most difficult moments. Over dessert, traditional apple pie with whipped cream, Kathy stood up and asked for attention. She was now a tall 13-year-old, looking more and more like her mother, but with her father's character. "I wanted to say something about my dad and my other mom." She looked at Annie with a tender smile. "For a long time, Dad was sad, and Miss Annabelle was lonely. But together, they became the best people in the world. And I think sometimes people meet so they can become better, and to show that love can win against hate and truth against lies." Annie wiped a tear with an elegant tissue. "Kathy, that's the most beautiful speech I've ever heard, because I was telling the truth. And Dad always says the truth is the most beautiful thing." Margaret stood up and raised a glass of champagne. "I would also like to say something. 3 years ago, I ran away because I thought love was about possession. But now I know that true love is sometimes about giving up. And sometimes the best proof of love is allowing another person to be happy with someone else." She looked at Annie. "Thank you for making my family smile again." So in the evening, when everyone had gone, Annie and Chris sat alone in their first joint cafe, the same one where they met. The owner, Ms. Millie, had already closed the place, but she let them stay, remembering their first conversation. "Do you regret anything?" Annie asked, playing with her wedding ring. "I regret that we didn't meet sooner. But if we had met sooner, we wouldn't have been ready for what we have now. If you hadn't gone through all that, you wouldn't have become the man I fell in love with." Chris nodded. "Every cloud has a silver lining. What do you think people would say if they knew our whole story? That sometimes love comes at the most unexpected moment, and that sometimes you have to go through the darkness to appreciate the light." Annie looked at the reflection of the city lights in the window. "I love you, Chris Nolan. And I love you, Annabelle Keller Nolan." "Sounds beautiful. Our whole life will be beautiful. Maybe not easy, but beautiful." Chris built a house on the outskirts of Boston in Wellesley, not far from the famous colleges. It was large and bright, with a garden full of apple and cherry trees, with a porch where Annie could read her legal files in the shade of grapevines. The house had a traditional New England architecture, red shingles, white walls, wooden shutters, but with modern amenities. "Is this really our house?" Kathy asked when she saw the finished building for the first time. "Ours," Chris confirmed. "Yours, mine, and Mom Annabelle's." The girl was already 15 and studying in a math and physics high school, dreaming of studying architecture like her mother. She was a tall, elegant teenager, but she had retained her childlike spontaneity and wisdom. Annie took early retirement and became a law lecturer at Harvard University. Her classes on legal ethics were immensely popular. Students came not only from Boston, but from all over the country to listen to the woman who had sacrificed her career for justice. "How are your studies, honey?" Chris asked during Sunday dinner, carving a roast duck with apples according to Annie's grandma's recipe. "Great, Dad. But you know what's the best part?" "What?" "When I tell people what my name is and who my parents are, everyone says I'm lucky to have such parents, and that our story is in social studies textbooks." Annie smiled, serving young potatoes with dill. "And what do you tell them?" "That I've always known that, and that sometimes the best things come after the most difficult times, and that sometimes you have to be very brave to fight for what's right." "A smart girl," Chris said, kissing his wife's hand. "She learned from the best," Catherine replied. Margaret now came more often, every weekend, and sometimes even in the middle of the week. She found a new partner in New York, an architect named Mark, who was understanding of her complicated family situation. She now lived in a small house in Wellesley, a 5-minute walk from Annie and Chris's house. "It's weird, but beautiful," she would tell her friends. "I have an ex-husband, his new wife, our daughter, and a new partner, and everyone likes each other." That evening, when Kathy went to the movies with her friends and Margaret returned to her house, Annie and Chris sat alone on the terrace, looking at the stars over Boston. The city lights sparkled in the distance, and the air was filled with the scent of the perpetual apple trees. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't fainted that day?" Annie asked, cuddling up to her husband. "I do, and I'm grateful for that faint." "Why?" "Because it showed me that sometimes you have to fall for someone to lift you up, and that sometimes that person has been waiting for you your whole life, and you don't even know it." Annie smiled in the darkness. "So fainting was the best thing that ever happened to me." "Second best." "And what was the first?" "That I allowed myself to love you despite everything." Kathy graduated from high school with top grades and was accepted into the architecture program at MIT, the same department her mother had once attended. On the day she started her studies, the whole family, Annie, Chris, Margaret, and even Mark, went to the academic year opening ceremony. "Isn't this strange?" Kathy asked, standing in front of the university building. "Mom finished architecture here, Dad finished construction, and now I'm starting architecture." "It's not strange," Annie replied. "It's a continuation. Every generation builds on the foundations of the previous one." Chris's company, Nolan and Daughter, grew to 10 employees and became one of the most respected construction firms in New England. It specialized in the renovation of historic buildings, churches, townhouses, estates. Chris often said that he was rebuilding not only buildings, but also his faith in justice. Annie wrote a book, The Judge and the Custodian, A Story of True Love, which became a bestseller and was translated into several languages. All proceeds from the book went to a foundation to help victims of judicial errors. "I never thought I would become a writer," she would say during book signings. "But you were always a storyteller," her readers would reply. "You told a story about justice." On the 20th anniversary of their first meeting, Annie and Chris decided to renew their vows. This time they organized the ceremony in their garden, under the apple trees they had planted themselves. Over 100 people came: judges, engineers, Annie's students, Chris's employees, neighbors, friends. Kathy, now a 20-year-old student, was the wedding officiant. Margaret and Mark took photos. Agnes, now retired, prepared a traditional American wedding cake. 20 years ago, Annie said during her speech, "I fainted in a courthouse. I thought it was the worst day of my life. Today I know it was the best. And I thought I was sentenced to a life in the shadow of the past," Chris added. "But Annie showed me that the past is a foundation, not a prison." As the sun set over Boston and the guests slowly dispersed, Annie and Chris were left alone in the garden filled with illuminated lights. Kathy had gone to the city with friends, and Margaret and Mark were returning to New York. "Is this happiness?" Annie asked. "This is more than happiness," Chris replied. "This is peace." And so ends the story of the judge and the custodian, who discovered that love knows no social boundaries, that justice sometimes comes from compassion, not from rules, and that the most beautiful stories are born from the greatest adversity. In a small town near the Rockies, an old woman now sometimes tells her grandchildren about a judge and a custodian who showed that the truth always wins, provided that there are people brave enough to fight for it. And in Boston, in a house full of laughter and apple trees, a family lives that knows every cloud has a silver lining. In Wellesley, where the birds sing every morning, and where you can see the Rockies on a clear day, Annabelle Keller Nolan wakes up every morning next to the man she loved against all odds. And Chris Nolan knows that every new day is a gift, an opportunity to build something beautiful. Sometimes on Sunday afternoons, they sit together on a bench in their garden, watching the apple tree they planted on their wedding day grow. And when someone asks them for the recipe for happiness, they answer, "You have to have the courage to fight for the truth, and you have to have a love that is stronger than fear." Like Chris, who lost everything and found love, would you have the courage to fight for justice? Write in the comments where you are watching this story of true American love from